Compassion in a t-shirt? Compassion in a t-shirt. Compassion in a t-shirt. Welcome to Compassion in a t-shirt. My name's Dr. Stan Steindl. Today I'll be speaking with Dr. Kristin Dempsey, who I have the pleasure of knowing through the Motivational Interviewing network of trainers. She's a psychotherapist, educator and trainer in San Francisco, USA, and she works in private practice and at both the Wright Institute and San Francisco State University. She's recently written a book called the Harm Reduction Workbook for Addiction, Motivational Interviewing Skills to create a personalized recovery plan and make lasting change. In our conversation, we'll be discussing how the harm reduction approach is based on a foundation of compassion and self-compassion. And Kristin offers some wonderful insights regarding what compassion is in the context of working with addictions. Please enjoy. And so I bring you Dr. Kristin Dempsey. Dr. Kristin Dempsey, lovely to see you and have you on Compassion in a T-shirt.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm excited to be here. Really enjoyed the podcast.
Great, thank you. You've written this wonderful book recently, the Harm Reduction Workbook for Addiction, Motivational Interviewing Skills to create a personalized recovery plan and make lasting changes. I wondered whether we could start with harm reduction. What is harm reduction, really, I guess, and your take on all of that?
Right. So as you might imagine, I've had a lot of opportunities to really speak to harm reduction in the last couple months since the book's been out, right? And of course, the harm reduction itself has been just so kind of in the news, and people are talking about it, thinking about it, and exactly what is it? And so harm reduction is, I mean, it's simply that as we're thinking of it as like a set of strategies. So there's a behavioral component, a way of being, a way of talking about behavior in ways that give people options to reduce harm, as opposed to only having like one choice, which often might say like be abstinence or to quit a behavior entirely. And so often, unfortunately, harm reduction and like abstinence approaches, when I'm saying abstinence, like stopping a behavior, stopping substance use, it's often seen as a binary thing of like, well, you can be harm reduction and reduce, or you can quit altogether. And unfortunately, as of many binary pieces, the both and doesn't really feel like much of a choice for people. And really, it's not totally accurate, because abstinence is actually one of many harm reduction types of approaches. So it's part of the basket of harm reduction, as opposed to being something separate from this or that. It's both and. It's all of that potentially. And what's so great about the harm reduction approach is that gives folks a chance to really think about, given all of my options and my context and my world and who I am, where can I start making choices? And it's wonderful because we're helping people get started in a process of learning about themselves, without feeling anything forced upon them or making commitments that they aren't ready to make or don't want to make. That's actually harm reduction with a small h, small r. But there's also harm reduction with a large H, a large R, that we have. I think it's an international movement, which is really to improve the quality of life for people who are using substances, using drugs. So there's a social movement, a social justice movement that's around harm reduction that you might have heard of. So I sometimes make the distinction between the two.
Yes, harm reduction, sort of without capitals, is it's a really good point, that it is a whole range of possibilities. In fact, in some ways, it could be really anything that a person might kind of come up with or choose to do, or changes they might make. It might include abstinence or a whole range of other things, but the key is that notion of reducing harm. Harm reduction with capitals is sort of more looking at sort of society and systems, and trying to kind of reduce harm more broadly, I guess, in terms of people's lives and so on. It's kind of interesting, because when I think about compassion, and as you know, this is Compassion in a T-shirt, so it's sort of a bit of a lens that I'm sort of thinking about all of this. Paul Gilbert sometimes says, that compassion in simple terms is, may I be helpful rather than harmful towards
Yeah.
myself and others. And so, in
Right.
a funny sort of a way, I guess, it fits there that harm reduction comes, it sort of is a compassionate motivation. What would you say about that in terms of harm reduction and where that compassionate motivation might fit in?
Yeah, harm reduction is all about compassion, uh, and in that way, it does really distinguish itself from the whole history of how many parts of the world that we've approached. I'm thinking really specifically about substance abuse treatment in most places where there's been a certain amount of mandate, of non-choice of programming, of a certain way of doing it. You're either doing it right or you're doing it wrong, as well as a lot of assumptions about people who use substances, and a lot of like really negative assumptions about people who people lie, or people are trying to deceive, or in denial, or resistant, like all these negative kind of labels. Whereas harm reduction is about none of that. It's about
Mm,
anyone coming in is like, everyone's unique and everyone has a special place. And people lie when they don't feel safe, or
mm,
people are defensive or resistant when someone's trying to force them to do something they don't want to do. So in this context, we don't see people like that, because when you give folks choice, they come along nicely, right? Because
mm,
they get to choose how they're going to come along. So in that particular way, harm reduction is hugely compassionate, because it's just so respectful of the fact that we can trust people, and honor people and value people enough to let them choose,
mm.
how to get started.
Mm. Yeah, it's sort of tapping into their intrinsic wisdom in a way, sort of removing some of the barriers that can rise up when we do try to tell people what to do, when we do start to judge or even shame people for things like you're in denial or you're being too willful about this or something like that. If we can remove that sort of threat system activation, people can feel safe, then actually, they often know what would be really a useful thing to do for their own health and well-being.
Absolutely. And with safety really does come a lot more willingness, right? If I feel
Mm,
like I'm not being judged, and if I'm feeling like I'm not a bad person, and this is an okay thing to talk about, and um, you are willing, or it's okay for me to have this conversation, so much can come forth.
mm,
There's so
mm,
many opportunities for people to learn about themselves.
mm,
And I say this a lot, like wherever we start, like that's all treatment. So I don't think of any of this as like pre-treatment to getting someone to quit. Like if that happens and that's what somebody wants,
mm,
yeah, wonderful for them. But everything has value.
mm,
Whatever it is that someone's doing, whether they're cutting back, or they're using differently, or learning about themselves by going to a group, whatever it might be, it's all important.
mm. I'm just sort of thinking out loud, but if I think of perhaps the health professional or the therapist or that sort of thing, they're often motivated by compassion. They're sort of wanting to help. They're wanting to reduce harm and reduce suffering. And yet they can sometimes slip into certain behaviors, certain ways of approaching the person or the situation that creates unsafeness or creates that kind of, or sort of is a part of that resistance. What's happening there, do you think, when people are really so compassionate in a way and yet inadvertently, I suppose, create these kind of blocks?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with, and we talk about all the time in motivational interviewing, with that pressure to fix and solve problems.
Mm,
And I think with substance use, or a behavioral compulsion, whatever it is that we're looking at, that's like an addiction, so to speak. It feels like the stakes are even higher, and
mm,
there's a sense of, oh, this person's gonna, they're really gonna hurt themselves. And yes, I mean,
mm,
we definitely know that harm can happen, and that's why we're
mm,
interested in harm reduction. So I think when any of us are in a place where we're feeling that danger, that the panic button can start to happen. Panic button can start
Mm.
us showing up, and that we can lose ourselves a little bit and start to slip into that fix it mode.
Mm.
And I think there's that, like, that's maybe my individual, kind of approach just as a person. But of course, that's never the case, right? We're all part of our system. So if we have a
Mm.
larger system too, that's really involved in outcome, and what's happening with this particular help seeker, are they achieving the goals, are they achieving the goals that we stipulate here? And in a lot of places, and I currently live in a place where there's a lot of concern about people using substances, and what are we going to do about them? There's all along a continuum too of people's relationship to substances, and the impact of the consequences of their use. That there gets to be, I think, a larger picture too of, this is a big problem, someone needs to solve it. And sometimes the systems can really be pushing down pretty hard on treatment providers to
Mm.
solve these systemic problems, or individual what have you, and that can really create that sense of push.
Yeah. Yes, from an individual sort of health professional point of view, that kind of fixing reflex, isn't it? That it's hard to
Absolutely.
resist sometimes. Like the stakes are so high, the potential, or maybe even the current suffering, but certainly the potential suffering is sort of ringing alarm bells, and we really want to help this person and help them to suffer less. And actually, you sort of said, the panic kind of feeling that sometimes the health professional themselves, well, I guess their threat system is a bit activated too. So you end
100%.
up, yeah, you end up with the person that's seeking help being a bit threat system activated, and perhaps not feeling safe yet, and that sort of thing. It's a very big thing to seek help. Then you get the health professional who's a little bit threat system activated too, and they're anxious, and so they're starting to kind of push and fix and so on, and I guess they're sort of bouncing off each other in a
They
way.
really are. Another thing I just thought of too, and I know this might be different for people in different countries where they have different healthcare systems, but I know where I'm from, first of all, it's hard to get into any kind of treatment center, and
Mm.
that often there's an expectation of, someone will be treated, and often that means abstinence within 30 days or 90 days, or there's certain
Yeah.
stipulations around that. And the beds or the spaces for people to be treated there, the ration. So there's a lot of pressure then to be like, I gotta produce a product here. I have to get someone and get them out,
Mm.
consciously or unconsciously stated, right? That's really very much out there. So that creates a lot of pressure in a way where it's about, we
Mm.
have to have a certain outcome.
Yes, there's the sort of the individual internal pressures that many health professionals might feel, and then there's the more systemic pressures, and trying to reach certain outcomes, achieve certain goals within certain time frames, and cost, I guess, sort of comes into that pressure as well. And you're sort of alluding to, beyond that, there's some of the unconscious processes too, maybe even the biases, I guess, that sometimes people feel about, yes, those who maybe are using drugs, and certain unconscious biases are at play for the health professional, and we become sometimes a little bit patronizing in a way of those help seekers, because of unconscious processes.
Right. Yeah. Unconscious. And I think too, just the history of the very conscious way that we've labeled folks, and even in our training.
Uh,
I mean, I remember being trained in ways where it was just like, okay, this is difficult work you're taking on, working with these substance abusers. And with
mm,
the idea that expect to be lied to, expect to get various amounts of pushback, and people aren't going to know what they need. And I mean, just, yeah, just the training was just so patronizing. Absolutely. And those are
mm,
just a couple of things I'm thinking of. And I'm also
mm.
spinning into thoughts about family members, right? Too, just the
Oh,
way we just think of people who have people in their family who they love who maybe have a substance use issue, and the whole idea of like codependency and enabling, and all the illness attached with the codependent who's I guess just that codependent along, and I don't even use that term anymore, but it's just
Mm.
all the ways you're trained to really, see people as really, really defective, and how that absolutely seeps in currently into the present moment to how we see
Mm.
people. So yeah, so much shame there, right? And such an important place to be able to step back and have some compassion. And this is
Mm.
all about having compassion in a really different way.
Yeah, shame is such a big theme in amongst all of what you're saying, isn't it? You know, the sort of shame and kind of shaming and the sort of inadvertent shaming, you know, or unwittingly we might shame a person, but also sometimes it is a more conscious sort of labeling in ways that can be shaming as well. I mean, in some ways, um, the harm reduction approach is really beautiful because it opens it all up. It means that there's all sorts of possibilities here. You know, there's remember that video with Terry Moyers, and she says there's definitely more than one right way. And I've always loved that quote from her because it's so true. Like if we can open it up and we can sort of really explore all the many different great ways that people can change in order to reduce harm or to sort of alleviate suffering, then that in itself steps us a little bit away from the shaming.
Oh, absolutely. Because with that, with this idea of like the menu of options, where there's just all different kinds of choices, that in of itself is just so compassionate, right? Just flexibility is compassionate. It's inherently compassionate in so many ways.
Mm,
And like I don't
mm,
need to control or judge. Like we can be really open here. So many
mm,
things can be right.
mm. Just little question, little side question. You've mentioned respect, you've mentioned flexibility. What are some of the other kind of qualities in and around compassion for you? Are there other sorts of words there or qualities that you would see is part of what makes a compassionate kind of approach or a compassionate person?
Well, definitely, of course, the classic piece of like really wanting to reduce someone's suffering.
Hmm.
So this idea of, whatever my role is, can I step back and say that I'm really doing this? And I may have this sense of, oh, I'm a certain provider. I have a certain scope of practice. Great. And then within the scope of practice, like, are there other things I can work in here that are really useful for people in ways that um, can alleviate, yeah, this suffer and the pain that doesn't have to happen. So let me give you an example. I am like a psychotherapist, but like a master's level psychotherapist here in the US. And we have certain, scopes of practice. In California, we can actually do a lot of different types of psychotherapy. But it wasn't until relatively recently, like within the last, I'd say 15 years or so. And again, I'm sure different programs might have trained people differently, but it wasn't until relatively recently, at least in my state, California, that we really started to teach like counselors. And again, social workers get this as part of their training. It is their training, but counselors really, how to really advocate and how to really, be in a relationship and do things like, case management and linkage and warm handoff and like those types of behaviors. It's like, oh, is that part of my job description? And my thing is like, it reduces suffering. It absolutely should be part of our job description. So maybe I'm thinking more flexibly too about who I am so I can be more compassionate. So there's a big part about reducing suffering and how that shows up in my work. And then also for me, it's like perspective taking. Like I have my ability to be able to hopefully do some sort of self-reflection and see myself in the world and how I'm interacting in different environments. And can I imagine what it might be like for that person sitting across from me who may have just such a different history and different contexts and such? Can I try to imagine? And can I even try to imagine for a little bit? And I find that really helps tremendously for myself. You get in touch with a place that really is very heartfelt and very much like wanting to be in service of that person. So I think a lot of ideas like around servant leadership is to me very much part of compassion. Like how can I really, in a very humble, um, and you know, serving way, be there for you.
Mm. Yeah, so many great points there. That they're really, the reducing suffering is kind of, that's kind of the compass, isn't it? That's what really is basically at the heart of it. Can we sort of notice and engage with suffering and take steps to help reduce that suffering? That's really the sort of the compass, the direction that the compassion is taking. But then around that, there's all sorts of possibilities, being able to be flexible, be creative, think in multiple levels of approach and strategies. But sort of, we're kind of thinking up the levels, but then we're also trying to kind of focus in to the perspective of the person themselves, and what might their experience of all this be, and can I put aside my own judgments or my own experiences and instead open myself up to taking the perspective of that other person. I guess empathy is in there, mentalizing, being able to really, I guess it takes a lot of effort, and it's often an iterative process, but yeah, it's really trying to understand the mind of the other and what this is like for them. And that then guides us in terms of our flexible creative thinking to what might be helpful.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking too, Stan, make me think of some of this, just about my experience of how not being able to freely talk about one's relationship to substances, like how that increases suffering, and I'm thinking just about my own career span. And, I've worked with people who are, just really kind of the top of their fields, highly functional, just incredible leaders in our community who are talking to me in private about the suffering they have around their substance use, as well as working with folks who, um, were living on streets and are unhoused and maybe have spent times in and out of, hospitals and such. And, there's a thread that kind of goes through everyone in between about, how they're struggling with their ability to safely be able to talk about their suffering in a way that people actually hear and see them, and everyone, kind of has that shame or that feeling of limitation, of something that they feel like they have to do. And to give someone the gift of being able just to talk about, like, hey, what's happening? Can I just be here for you? Is such a powerful piece above and beyond, um, even any, steps,
Mm.
to stop or to cut back or whatever it might be. Just that listening is such a powerful piece, which is
Mm.
why I'm always talking about it as like that's the work. If you want to call it treatment, fine. If you want to call it engagement, fine. But to me, it's like it's the work. It's happening. The process is happening. And I'm also thinking of that, like with the book. And I think, even my editor was kind of thinking about that at some point. Having this conversation about, for people who don't have access to someone to talk to, or someone who just might not be ready, like this is another option. Someone could just be picking this up and just starting to have a conversation maybe with themselves that's guided in a way for them to start to be able to express some of this.
Yeah, no, that's very inspiring. That the idea of sort of listening well, and someone really feeling like that there is a person listening, that and they feel heard and understood, and it's a kind of a de-shaming, isn't it, when there's someone who is open-mindedly listening to your experience. I was going to bring it back to the book now, because yes, you've tried to sort of replicate that, but in a sort of almost self-help type of way. Like, how can a person offer themselves that chance to kind of explore their relationship with perhaps their substance use and so on? That's an early part of the book. So can you unpack that a little bit? What is that sort of process, or how does that work in a um, self-help kind of guide like you've written?
Yeah. So the way I kind of wrote this, what I was thinking about was, um, using kind of motivational interviewing as an inspiration, or thinking of like the spirit, the values and attitudes that we bring to motivational interviewing, as well as the skill sets that we use when we talk. We have this conversational style of motivational interviewing, and then some of the tasks that we're involved in, from kind of engaging and helping folks focus and then explore more before we get to some sense of planning. how can I create something where someone can do all that, or if they're not having a conversation with anyone else. And so this idea of using MI and self-help it's a newer idea. Definitely there's some other books out there where people are doing that, and it's kind of a really interesting process because MI is so engaging, and it is so understandable, and such a way to help people really feel like they're able to be open and explore without a lot of barriers. Like, okay, this makes sense. I think we can work on this. So the way I designed it is that these one would start off with the beginning of the book, really kind of getting in touch with some of the ideas that we talk about in the spirit of MI, and looking at things like around someone's sense of self-acceptance and strengths. And I talk a little about empowering and values, and talk a bit about self-compassion. Definitely talk about that, and there's places for people to work through different exercises to explore this, and then I start to move into using some of the skill sets just to help someone explore their own ideas. So I have like exercises based on reflections that we
Mm.
teach in MI. Ask themselves their own evocative questions and do their own affirmations. And of course, we summarize and start to pull it together, with the idea that around, at the end of the book, it's like chapter 10 or something, like someone could choose to create like a plan, like some sort of next step specific plan for themselves. And I also wrote in the introduction there somewhere of in addition to this process one could go into, you could maybe just pull out a chapter and just decide you want to explore that, and that hopefully that chapter would be enough also on its own where there could just be a lot of learning. So my main takeaway in all of this, and what I'm really interested in, is harm reduction and someone's relationship to substance use, and all of this should just be all about learning all the time. It's all about learning, and that the behaviors I do and how I follow up on this, it's about learning. And I just think learning and curiosity is the antidote to shame, right? It's like if we
Mm.
can kind of make that shift from what you're supposed to do into let's just try to understand this, like that frees us up. It's a real freedom. So that's what I'm hoping to do in the book, is just to provide this place where people can have this freedom to be curious and creative with themselves, to think about, well, how are these connections being made, what's a bit of my history, and what kind of choices do I have.
Mm. I can sort of sense the efforts there to include those qualities you've been talking about, the respect and flexibility and perspective taking, but in a way conjuring up that sort of stuff for oneself in a self-compassionate way. MI, motivational interviewing, is often an interpersonal process, isn't it? A kind of a conversation, but we can think of it as we're having kind of conversations with parts of ourselves, in a sense, in a more self-guided sort of a way. Um, what are some of the themes that might come up when people are exploring their relationship with their substance use? What do you sort of notice, even in your work with people, or what do you anticipate coming up there in as people work through the book?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's some of the things that came up as exercises, and I think some of this has to do with my own approach and what I've learned and my own experiences, etc. Um, is just thinking about, and I'm always asking people around about the idea of, you're doing whatever you're doing. We do whatever we do for a reason. And
Mm,
so with this exploration of like, what's the function of the substance use, and then um, you know, what's the other side of that, like there's a way that it's functioned and the way that maybe it's not so helpful. So there's a lot of places for that kind of conversation of just the back and forth, with really this understanding of you have this issue, so to speak, because you're probably trying to take care of yourself in some way. And there's definitely people out there who'll talk about, the fact that, if it wasn't for my substance use at some point, like I wouldn't be alive now. Like it helped me, survive trauma or overcome, various pieces. Like it was a really important piece. Um, and to help people maybe come to a compassionate understanding of their history around that. And I do have a number of places too, for things that are either directly around self-compassion or what I might call self-compassion adjacent, with this idea of just coming to understanding and making sense, and maybe with some aspect of self-forgiveness and also perspective taking. If you were to stand back and look at what you did or what you are doing, and trying to understand it as objectively as possible, how might this look different for you? So there's that. Another important kind of theme that comes through, and I just love this so much in motivational interviewing, because we can know all kinds of things that could or should or might be changed, to maybe be change targets. And I can have a certain thought about that, and someone I'm talking to can have a different thought. But regardless of whatever the change target is, the thing that actually I think allows it to really happen is anyone's particular sense of strength or agency. It's like, it's really hard for me to change. It's hard for me to be motivated for changing, maybe especially if I've had, a pretty impactful relationship with a substance, let's say. But it's going to be really hard if I don't think that I'm worthy in some way, or if I don't feel I have certain strengths or abilities. And the strength piece is always, I find, really wonderful for people to review, even when someone's like, oh, not really, or don't really believe this about myself. I'm very much into seed planting, and the idea that many times we go through this a few different times in a few different ways to think about, the ways we've been successful, and I think that's important. So there's definitely that as an emerging theme, and of course, all around values. Values of like what it is that you care about, really having that kind of fuel your journey. I think that's actually one of the chapter titles. Having values fuel our journey, which I love, and then there's also an idea in here too, of course, of just choice. That whatever you're learning here, you can choose, and you can choose how much and in what way you want to approach your next steps. So I think those are some really common themes throughout.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Yes, and I don't know if this is the right word, but it sort of feels, as I'm listening to you, especially in that first little section there, that there really is a kind of an innocence to it all, isn't there? There's an innocent kind of wish to sort of, well, to live and survive and cope, and often that's where it begins. Something that's really very, very innocent. That one is born, things start to happen. We kind of get shaped. Sometimes there is trauma or other experiences, and it's just this effort that people make to kind of try to cope and survive with all of that. That's often maybe where it begins, and to be
Yeah.
able to bring a little bit of understanding, but even a little bit of kind of sympathy to oneself. Okay, that's tough, that's hard, that's where it kind of comes from, and rather than the kind of more shaming, kind of self-loathing feeling that can sometimes be there, but instead a kind of a sympathetic concern for myself and how I have now found myself where I am, understanding the function, how it's kind of served me, that sort of mind awareness, understanding my own mind and how I've gotten to this place. And then also thinking about, like you say, strengths, values, starting to create direction out of all of that. But what do you think of that sort of notion of just the innocence sometimes of where all this begins?
I love the idea of innocence. I had never really thought of that way. And I'm thinking maybe other ideas around like innocence. Yeah, like I'm thinking of like pure. And I
Mm.
think we think of pure as like, someone without sin, and yeah, I just love that idea of, doesn't matter, someone's been having this relationship with substances or whatever. It's like, let's just move away from this whole idea of the sin piece, right? Because that always gets so caught up into this. Like if they're sinning people, Sin City, right? Or places where there's always like a lot of drink and everything else, right? And drugs and everything else. And like there's a purity to the idea of innocence. And like, yeah, let's just allow people to tap into that, whatever that is for them, this sense of, and I mean purity in the true sense of just being able to be free of some of that
Mm,
baggage. You know what else I'm thinking too when you said innocence? Another word that came up for me, and just in the way you were talking about it, Stan, was about hope, and how hope really is so important, and how when there's like these options and this place of like, hey, wherever you start, that's going to be great. That's going to be important. The most important thing is that you're showing up. The most important thing is that you're talking and that you're willing. That just allows so much hope to bloom forth.
mm,
Right? Just so much spaciousness for someone to take a next step.
mm.
It's expansive. It's not constricting.
Yes, it takes a lot of courage though, doesn't it, for the person? It takes a lot of courage to hope. It takes a lot of courage to reflect. It takes a lot of courage to really explore, all of these different parts of the relationship that we might have to alcohol or another substance. In some ways, courage is the key, isn't it? When we're diving into something like a sort of a harm reduction, self-compassionate kind of approach like this. Mm.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's where the spirit of MI is so important as
Mm.
well, because with that, we're creating that psychological safety. And I think for people to really be able to tap into their courage, to feel safe, to move forward, take that next step, we need to have that place of like, I'll be held.
Yeah.
I won't immediately be judged or harmed. And it's okay to do this, and I have some
Mm.
choices, and someone's wanting me to make my own decision. That
Mm.
all of that really creates that sense of safety there.
Mm. So we sort of the journey that someone might take through the workbook is, that can we soften the shame, soften some of that more self-critical kind of approach to ourselves, create a sense of safeness within that, and also a sense of, kind of understanding, broader understanding of ourselves and how we have come to be here. Tap into certain strengths, trying to affirm those strengths and those qualities that we can maybe bring to what happens next, our values and why that might make some sort of changes or actions important. What happens next then in the workbook? The sort of really trying to then cultivate that motivation to actually change or to make certain harm reduction based changes.
Right. So what happens next, I think, is that it really ends with this idea of, what's your next best step for yourself? And that it's a step that you can try out, you can learn from, you can then maybe change, you can start to add steps. There are places there in the book too for resources. So if there was a situation where someone's like, I want to explore more, or kind of get more support beyond this book, we have some other locations for self-help, for
Mm.
instance. Yeah, so it's really about starting that conversation. And I think the way the book's designed, I mean, we go through 10 chapters, and again, you can go through as much or as little as you like. And I know a number of therapists who are using it now, which really delights me, of course, but they're taking out exercises and bringing them into groups and just having people just start to explore. And even though there's places where you can just kind of go in and out, like if you were to go through this whole workbook in a particular way, like there would be like so much learning. It would just really seem to me that there'd be I would anticipate quite a bit more clarity. And I'm trying to be careful with my words, because for some people maybe there won't be, but there's I think a path there for someone to become maybe more focused, maybe be able to collect more understanding about themselves, be able to be in a place where, I'm in a better place of understanding and starting to move forward than I certainly was at the beginning of this. And that there may be some clarity on, well, maybe I want something that's more self-help. Maybe I want something that's more of like a formal treatment. Maybe I'm needing, certain amount, different times of the week or over the week, or, maybe I'm going to do some one-on-one therapy just to see where it goes. But at the end, I think there really is a place for people to, have a better sense of themselves.
Mm. And I can sort of imagine, with that awareness, with that better sense of oneself, it's the seed planting thing, isn't it? In a way, like you can sort of imagine someone, going through their life, having worked through some of this, and thinking to themselves, I might just not do that yet. I might just put that off for a moment, or they might think to themselves, I really probably am a pretty creative person, or like they'll just have these little moments maybe where all of that reflecting on themselves and so on, the seeds that are planted just sort of sprout little seedlings of change, just sprinkled through their day almost. And it might be bigger things like I'm going to start therapy, or I'm going to actually, join a group or something like that. But it might be these little sprinklings of change that just come into their day. And that's harm reduction, I suppose.
It is. And I think about that too, even as you're talking and as you've been asking me questions. Of course, I'm intimately aware of everything in the book, but I suddenly start to realize, there's things that I wrote that I myself think about a lot, mainly because of course I wrote it and I've been thinking and studying this stuff for a while, but I'll think about that place of, my first attempt in learning something, when I supposedly fail, so to speak. And I'll think about ways of describing instead of judging, or various aspects of my values or strengths in the ways that it was constructed in the book. And so I think once you kind of work through and answer some things, like it could stick. And one of my favorites is also I love this anyway in MIs, is the double-sided reflection. I have a whole series of people walking through the good things and the not so good things about their substance use, and being able to create their own double-sided reflections, and just that process of practicing both on thinking in the way that it increases flexibility and more options for choice and change. So it has this sense of resonance of hanging in there once we've kind of walked through some of this material.
Yeah. Sort of sticking. I like that word as well. Little
Yeah.
things might stick. It's a very silly example, but I've been determined this year to floss better, because every time I go to the dentist, she says, "You're still not flossing," sort of thing. And I thought I would secretly try this year, so that or this 6 months, so that when I go back, I'm going to see whether she notices. But anyway, as I say, it's a very type mild example, but it is always interesting when we try our own behavior changes, isn't it? And just to notice the way that it's difficult, the way that we relate to ourselves, the frustration we can have with ourselves when it doesn't quite go to plan, the sort of the burden or exhaustion that we can feel, and here we go again, that sort of a thing. The way that more encouraging self-talk can sometimes sneak in and be more helpful. Just have a go, just do it. Only take a couple of minutes. It'll be worth it in the end, or whatever. This is important to you. It's an important change. So you sort of, it is really nice to just notice even the little things that we do, and the way behavior change is difficult, actually. And so little things that stick can often be really quite powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully inspirational. So the little things that stick, can be built upon and built upon, and give someone, again, some sense of like success.
Mm,
Impact, something that was impactful to me, even if it was really small. I very much believe in the whole idea of, being able to reinforce that, like lots and lots of encouragement and noticing of someone's smallest changes, because even that little bit of reinforcement is
yeah.
inspiring for people. And hopefully this helps create those little pieces of moments for that.
So I always like to sort of ask about 3 tips, I suppose. Like if someone is, curious about this, as you say, it often starts with curiosity and that sort of thing, and they're sort of thinking about perhaps where they could begin a bit of a harm reduction journey or a change journey or that sort of thing. Well, and it doesn't have to be 3, but what might be 3 tips for someone who's really wanting to start this compassionate journey towards change?
Yeah, I think I think always I get back to just curiosity. So just wondering with oneself, and this is hard to do, especially around like a substance use or any kind of a kind of unhelpful, say, quote unquote, compulsive behavior, because again, of all the judgment and shame. But even uh, in that process, if you're just kind of wondering about, well, what's my history? How did this develop? Was there a time when it wasn't happening? And just almost like being able to create some sort of history, and even noticing then the places where some of the judgments show up. I know it's a big piece of the tip there. It's a
Yeah.
lot of work, but just maybe that attitude of curiosity.
Yes.
So I would say that being one tip for sure. Um, and maybe, the second tip is definitely some aspect of, and this definitely goes along with the curiosity of seeing always kind of the other side, that if you're in a situation of your history and finding that the words of I always or I never or um you know this can't or this won't, I mean, just being thoughtful about, is that always true? Is it always like this one way? Is it possible that there's another side of the coin? So if I'm thinking of, oh, I always use weed in the morning because I get so anxious and I can't possibly go to school. Can we think of a time when maybe that wasn't the case? Maybe there were times when I was able to do something, without the substance, and just be able to see myself, to be able to kind of scope back out and see myself in different situations, doing things slightly different, right? The different perspective taking can be helpful, and flexibility of the both and thinking that, there's times I really need this and times when I've been okay, or there's times when I really needed this and times when I really didn't want it, be able to have some practice on that. And then I think the other thing I would say around harm reduction is just being really aware that you have choices. You always have choices. You have lots and lots of choice. And that it's never just one answer or one solution. So if any of it try something and it's like, oh, this isn't quite right, like that's okay. There's no such thing as failure. It's all about learning. Everything's about learning all the time. So you can be free. You can really have this freedom to say, I have different options here. And sometimes that's hard too, right? Because it almost seems like there's too many options. But if you just start somewhere and just try and experiment with whatever feels doable, maybe that's okay. Maybe that's good enough. And then just see, like, how did that work out? So again, with this idea of this momentum, this curiosity, this openness, flexibility, this testing things out, that's the work.
Mm.
That's the work that will create change.
Mm. Yes. Yes, kind of curiosity of self and one's experience and one's life and how these things fit in with all of that. Openness to both sides, it's a kind of a curiosity, it's a kind of even a bit of a hypothesis testing, is that always right? Is there another side to
Right,
this?
right.
And then you always have choices, and it's about learning. You really made
Yeah,
that point too earlier on, that in some ways, that's the key, is just that openness to sort of learning and there's things that we can try from there. Well, Kristin, thanks very much for coming and chatting with me on Compassion in a T-shirt. I will definitely include links to your website and also to your book on Amazon. If people are sort of interested or curious or kind of want to find more of your stuff or be in touch, how can people find you?
yeah, thank you so much. So the website's great, and so people can find me there, and there's a place where you can submit a uh I guess a request to talk to me, that kind of thing. But you
Yeah.
can also follow me on LinkedIn
Okay.
under Kristin Dempsey, EDD, LMFT, LPCC. I got all these letters behind my names, but if you put that in, you'll be able to find me. And also on Facebook, I actually have a professional page, which is the Kristin Dempsey. And if you start typing in some of those licenses, I pop up. So it's the LMFT, LPCC. It'll pop up, and I put on there like different things that I've done and free trainings and podcasts and things that are coming up and books and all that good stuff. I post it on my social media as well as my website.
Hmm. I'll definitely put links to all of those things in the description on YouTube, so hopefully people can find you that way. But yeah, once again, thank you very much for talking with me on compassion in a t-shirt.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much, Dan. Really appreciate it. Enjoyed it.
Thank you.